Today, we're going to discuss Beethoven's Symphony No. 3, otherwise known as the Eroica Symphony. This great symphony emanated from Beethoven's middle period of composition. His life can essentially be divided up into three periods. There was his early period, which lasted up until about 1802. His middle period, which was from about 1803 to 1813. And then his late period, which was from about 1817 to 1827. This is basically how it's usually divided up. His middle period is interesting. It was a time of great optimism. Beethoven had emerged from a personal crisis. In 1802, he had contemplated suicide. This was in light of his impending deafness. He had noticed for many years that he was going deaf, but it had reached a point at which it affected his ability to perform in public. It affected him very deeply. This was a huge blow. And it was around this time that he wrote what is known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. He wrote this down in a place called Heiligenstadt. It expressed his despair, his misery. It was written to his relatives. He wanted them to understand how he was feeling and how he couldn't cope because of his deafness. And then somehow he managed to pull himself out of this slump. And there was a huge burst of optimism. You can hear this in the Eroica Symphony. It's full of optimism and hope. This period in his life was known for its heroism, its heroic nature. And in fact, Eroica means the heroic symphony. We're going to discuss why, in fact, it was called this. There's several reasons for that. But first of all, let's understand the optimism that emerged. Beethoven had decided that he was going to persevere. He was going to carry on with what he loved most, with music. And this optimism is clear in the way that he developed the theme. Let's listen, first of all, to the opening of the symphony and understand this theme. Let's go back to the beginning of the symphony. Now this is the opening theme. 2 chords. And then it stops on that unusual C sharp. So it's la 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 la. Actually, this theme would have been known during Beethoven's time as a common dance theme, a German dance theme known as a Deutsche. Deutsche, of course, being German, but that was the sort of dance music that was prevalent. So Beethoven, some people theorize that he wanted to transform this theme throughout the first movement in different ways. So at the beginning, it was a theme associated with the common folk, the vulnerable man who had faith, but at the same time was vulnerable. As the movement progresses, Beethoven develops this theme. It's not the only thematic material. There are other contrasting themes, but he does an enormous amount with a simple theme. Let's listen and see how this theme develops. So let's go back, and then we'll listen to the development of this thematic material. And then it comes in again. Ascending, la 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 la, but developing. And now it comes in tutti, the full orchestra. With the brass. It certainly has elements of heroism. But now listen to the other contrasting material. It sounds like an antagonist. The challenges that Beethoven was facing at the time. A dotted rhythm, and all sorts of conflicting material. But as the movement develops, this theme continues to pit itself against the antagonistic material. And so right at the end, it actually is transformed into an heroic fanfare on the brass. Beethoven's music was written during a time when the world believed in humanism. There were ideals in addition to heroism. The people lived in pursuit of the values of mankind, of humanism. And Beethoven had strong political views. This was part of the whole humanism idea. In fact, he was sympathetic towards the French cause, that this was the time of the French Revolution. You can hear the revolutionary nature of this music. Beethoven had a strong admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte, and initially he inscribed on the title page of this work that this work was dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte. In fact, he referred to it as the Bonaparte, the symphony. However, when Napoleon went so far as to crown himself emperor, Beethoven was strongly disillusioned. He couldn't stand for this tyranny, this sort of dictatorship, and so he scratched out the title page. I'll send you a picture in which you can see Beethoven scratching it out with great anger, with great violence. And eventually he published it under the title Sinfonia Eroica, because he still believed in the idea of heroism, perhaps not in Napoleon's attitude towards heroism. Let's consider how the protagonist, the main character, develops throughout the symphony. So we've got our first movement. This is the heroic music. We're going to look at the second movement in due course. Well, here the second movement is a funeral march in C minor. So the opening movement was an E flat major. So it's quite understandable that the relative minor of C minor might be used. And in fact, eventually this is transformed into the major mode. So C minor becomes a C major at the end of the work. Now we've got the funeral march in the second movement. Then you've got the scherzo, the third movement, which is a frivolous movement. It's light-hearted in nature. And then finally at the end, we've got the final movement, which is basically a set of variations. And in fact, some would say that Beethoven used the thematic material from Prometheus, which is one of his works. And Prometheus was a great hero. So there's this underlying theme of heroism in the music throughout. Indeed, one can hear that it is still almost classical music. It is built on the sonata form models of Haydn and Mozart. However, this was in fact the longest symphony written up until that point. Beethoven greatly expanded the model of sonata form. The themes are much longer. He did a lot more with them. But on the other hand, he is known for the economy of his thematic material. He would use one theme and subject it to many transformations as opposed to using all sorts of melodic material. Mozart was generous in his usage of melody. He would introduce many different melodies quite freely. His goal was to provide beautiful music. Beethoven wanted to actually subject a single theme to a series of transformations. Perhaps this was his way of emerging from a challenge. He would start out with a simple theme. He would subject it to a series of challenges, and it would be transformed. This is what they mean by the economy of Beethoven's thematic material. So to summarize, despite the fact that there are contrasting analyses of this work, what most analyses share are 4 points. We mentioned there is the economy of material, which Beethoven succeeds in utilizing. There is the great variety of gestures to which he subjects this material. There is the unprecedented expansion of the form of the work. It's no longer a simple sonata form. All of the themes are much longer than all the preceding symphonies. So this is the expanded form of the work. And finally, particularly with regards to this Eroica, there is the idea of the sense of struggle, a sense of achievement, and the progressive change over the course of the work. Now, as the Romantic era progresses, we'll see that this actually became a common trope, a common procedure, that there was a theme, it developed throughout the work, and there was a sense of achievement, a sense of arrival at the end of the work. We'll see this with Brahms's symphonies too. He did similar things to Beethoven. He also started out in a minor key, depicting great anxiety and tragedy. In fact, his first symphony also begins in C minor and progresses through the movements, eventually ending in triumph with a heroic theme in C major, similarly to Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. We're going to look at each of the movements of this work in greater detail in the coming weeks, but this is our introduction to Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, a magnificent work. Truly, in fact, some believe that this work ushered in the Romantic era in about 1802, 1803, in fact, when Beethoven published it. So this is the real beginning of the Romantic period and of our exploration of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony.